In February 2020, the Brooks Institute hosted approximately 80 of the most influential actors in the animal protection community to discuss the current state of the animal protection movement. 3 keynote speakers stimulated thinking and conversations. The speakers were Alexandra Horowitz, Sil Coe, and Dale Jamieson. Following is the presentation by Dale Jamieson.
Now, on to our exciting post-lunch speaker. Dale can hold a post-lunch crowd. No, any of our speakers could, of course, but it's Dale's honor to hold that place today. So Dale Jamieson, as many of you know, is a professor of environmental studies and philosophy, affiliated professor of law, and director of the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection at NYU. He has been teaching and writing about animal and environmental protection for more than 40 years. He's the author of many books, including Morality's Progress, essays on humans, other animals, and the rest of nature, and more recently, Reason in a Dark Time, Why the Struggle to Stop Climate Change Failed and What It Means for Our Future. And then very recently, with several co-authors, Discerning Experts, the Practices of Scientific Assessment for Environmental Policy. And he's also tried his hand as fiction, which some of you may not know yet, published a collection of short stories called Love in the Anthropocene with the novelist Bonnie Nadzem. So Dale is talking to us about the very big and very important topic, how to change the world.
Well, thank you, Kristen. I don't know where this should go. I think my chances of kicking it over are less than my chances of knocking it over, but we'll kind of see how that plays out. So on the grounds that gratitude is never redundant, I would again like to thank all of the folks from the Brooks Foundation, not just for hosting us, but for the really gracious and generous way that they put up with all of our idiosyncrasies, weirdness, and oddities, which are endemic both to college professors and to activists that we all know too well. So thank you very much, Brooks. I also want to say that it's a real honor for me to be on this platform with Alex Horowitz, who is an old and dear friend of mine whose work I've admired since she was a graduate student, and also with Sil Coe, who now another kind of interesting thing about Brooks is that somehow they've managed to identify probably the only 2 philosophers in the animal protection movement who studied both at San Francisco State and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Now, I'm not quite sure what to make of this. This is an empirical hypothesis. But I kind of think that the San Francisco residual is very difficult to eliminate. Okay, so my modest topic today is how to change the world. And if I have any particular expertise in this topic, it comes from my training as a philosopher. And as probably many of you know, Socrates, who's generally considered to be the founder of the discipline in the West, famously said, "One thing only I know, and that is that I know nothing." So this is the real expertise that I bring to this talk. And in a way, my real hope in this talk is that you come to share with me a lack of confidence in thinking that you actually know much about how to change the world. Not that this should keep us from acting, but in some way, I think overconfidence can be a real obstacle in our efforts. Now, the undeniable fact is that change does happen, and sometimes it happens without us. So, life was pretty sweet for the dinosaurs for about 175 million years. I mean, that's a long run, right? And then one day some dinosaur looks over her shoulder and sees this bright light in the sky, end of game dinosaur. These weird little mammals, start coming out of the nooks and crannies. Dinosaurs go extinct. This is real change, right? The world has really changed. Now, another way that the world changed without us can be sort of located with Mesa Verde, where some of you might have been there, which is this kind of wonderful site in southern Colorado that was inhabited by humans, I mean, really for more than a millennia, really 2 millennia in a sort of off and on basis, but for 700 years continuously. And then an incredible epic drought of massive proportions led to the depopulation of the site. This was presumably an act of nature, not an act of anthropogenic climate change, right? So sometimes things just happen that change the world exogenously. Now, sometimes we actually change the world without intending to, and we're doing that now with global climate change. I think probably most of you know that 2019 was one of the 2 or 3 warmest years on record. January 2020 is the warmest January in the record, so we really are, hey, we're changing the world. We're doing a massive transformation of the world, but nobody wants to do it. I mean, even people who are, who do things like own major oil companies, if they could just continue to maintain their profits without screwing up the atmosphere, they'd be quite happy to do that. It's just that if they have to choose between them, which wins. So it's not as though anybody really wants to bring this about, but this is what's happening as a result of our collective action. Now, sometimes we change the world intentionally, and on the left is a picture of the interstate highway system, about which a lot can be said, both positively and negatively, but it was probably the last great American infrastructure project that we've seen, which sort of dominated the last half of the 20th century. It's an interesting question as to whether we could ever do that again. And on the right is the Great Wall of China, which was actually begun in about the 7th century BCE, and actually was built, added to, and maintained for about 2 millennia. And it's probably the greatest single human transformation of the world that exists, at least in terms of the physical surface of the world. Now, the most profound changes, of course, are not changing the surface of the planet intentionally, but they have to do with deep societal changes. So the image on the left is a sculpture in Senegal at the famous World Heritage Site, the Senegal slave port, celebrating the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. The image on the right is the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of communism. Now, these are really world historical, profound, deep societal changes, which were intentional in the sense that hundreds, thousands, millions of people worked for these changes over decades and over centuries and succeeded in bringing them about. Now, there's some real puzzles about how this kind of deep societal change occurs. There's a kind of simple argument, really, which suggests that it can never occur because, after all, social change redistributes power, and why would those with power ever give it up? QED, I'm going to go take a nap now, right? Change is impossible. But yet we know, despite that argument, which makes the possibility of change seem quite mysterious, social change really does, in fact, occur, despite that kind of facile argument. And secondly, I think a really striking thing about this sort of deep social change is that when it occurs, it's unpredictable. Unpredictable ex ante. After it occurs, it appears necessary and inevitable, and as if the weight of history was on its side and would lead inevitably to this conclusion. Right? Kind of a very strange juxtaposition of attitudes. Now, a kind of simple way for thinking about how change happens was articulated pretty clearly by the physicist Max Planck. And for those of you who remember things like the Chicago 7 trial back in the 60s, I think it was Abby Hoffman who at the trial said to the judge, "We will dance on your grave," something like that. And so there's this idea of social change that just the old guys will eventually die out and we cool young people will replace them, and then, life will be sweet again. But of course, it's not quite so simple, because cool young people have a way of becoming nasty old people, and these values have a way of sort of continuing to recapitulate and so on. So there's no doubt that generational change is part of the story, right? But of course, it's much less of the story than we all think when we're 19. So now, in what follows, I'm going to provide a kind of analytic overview of what we know in this area. I'm going to make some cautionary remarks, and then I'm going to close with some empirically informed guesses about how to think about this question, about how to change the world. Now, again, I want to say at the outset that sort of in my overview is going to be very superficial. It's sort of my take of the literature and what we know. There are many people in this room who could be giving this talk that I'm giving that would have different sort of emphases and sort of bring different kinds of expertise and things to bear on this question. So this is really one snapshot of what we know in this area. So I want to begin really with some cautions or with some caveats. So when we talk about deep social change, the research, the literature, is really distributed across a very, very wide range of issues. So if you want to know about particular kinds of interventions and what they're likely to do in a particular context, I mean, the studies are often going to be in health, they're going to be in environment, they're going to be all over the place. This is a big problem generally for academics, because we mostly tend to read in our own little silos, that get ever narrower, and the idea of sort of trying to do the more synchronic thing is a real challenge. And there tend to be two major research traditions insofar as research is done in these areas, and they both have serious limitations. So one kind of research tends to be driven by economic paradigms, tends to be model-driven, highly abstract and counterfactual, and so it's often very difficult to apply in particular cases, because whether it's part of the unpredictability of change, whether change actually occurs here and now on this occasion in this area, depends enormously on contextual factors that sort of model-driven, abstract ways of thinking about change may not be very revealing of. But another research tradition is much more case-driven, and I'm going to be mentioning some of those studies. But of course, the problem there is it's often very difficult to generalize those studies. So if we know, for example, why Finns stopped eating lutefisk on Wednesdays and started eating more on Fridays, what is that actually going to tell us, say, about smoking cessation or something, right? How do we sort of generalize from one very particular, highly contextual case to another? The other thing, which I think is also really important, is that most of the research in this area tends to really focus, and for good reason, this isn't really a criticism, but it's important to notice, tends to focus on very specific observable behaviors or aggregate macro-level outcomes. So in other words, most of the literature on change focuses on things that we can count and things that we can measure. But yet, if you're talking about really deep and profound societal changes, right, the collapse of communism, the abolition of slavery, and so on, yeah, maybe retrospectively you could figure out what you should have counted previous to these events. But ex ante, sort of no amount of counting and aggregating is going to give you much of a prediction for what actually, in fact, resulted. Okay, so that being, whoops, I just lasered somebody by mistake, sorry. So that being said, I'm going to start with what I'm calling some paradoxes of intentional change. So these aren't paradoxes in the strict technical sense of paradox that philosophers like to use, but these are sort of 5 things I want to focus on where we might actually be surprised about the relationship between these things and the likelihood of creating change. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is information effects, and this is really one of the best studied areas when it comes to behavior change. It really goes back at least to the 1980s. I did some of this research myself. And basically the idea is that providing people with information has about as much a chance of changing their behavior as praying that they will change their behavior. Now there's two reasons for this. The overwhelmingly important reason is because providing information tends generally to have almost no measurable effect. In fact, back in the 80s when we were doing these studies of recycling behavior, what we discovered is that if you give people leaflets on how to recycle, the main effect of this is to increase the recycling rates because there's something else to recycle now. But I also want to say that there is some evidence, it's small and it's minimal, that actually petitionary prayer actually can help. Those are self-reported studies, of course, so. Which brings out another methodological problem in doing this kind of research. Okay, now again, I mean, part of why this is paradoxical is we know that information is important, right? It's not like, okay, we're not ever going to tell anybody anything again, because that doesn't work. We know that information has some kind of role to play here, but in terms of having any measurable statistical effect on change across the board, zilch. Now, it's particularly bad when information or education or intellectual competence gets mixed up with people's political ideologies. So this is work that probably a lot of people here know by Dan Kahane at Yale and others. But if you take this statement, there is solid evidence of recent global warming due mostly to human activities such as burning fossil fuels. Essentially what happens is people who know zilch about science but have different political ideologies are unlikely to disagree about this. But the more they know, the more likely their opinions are to diverge, right? That's how powerful the political effect is with respect to information in education. Now, there was a 2017 paper that tried to put a lot of this together in a bunch of different domains about GMO foods and nanotechnology, belief in human evolution, Big Bang, and all that kind of stuff. And they basically found the same effect in 4 of those areas. 2 areas, nanotechnology and GMOs, at that point they felt had not become politicized in the way that climate change, stem cell, and evolution had, and so you didn't sort of see this ideological effect, but in the other 4 areas they did. And so, their conclusion then is that science education and science literacy are actually associated with greater political and religious polarization, that is to say, more disagreement. And the reasons for this are interesting, and I kind of want to highlight these reasons. I mean, so one is fairly obvious, that's this phenomenon that's called motivated reasoning, which is the more that I know, the better able I am to defend my absurd views. Now anyone who practices law, is actually quite likely to be very good at this. I mean, this is really one of the kind of real benefits and takeaways of law school education, being able to give ingenious, arguments for really implausible legal theories. This is why people get paid a lot, right? But the other thing which I think is also quite relevant and important to us is that there's this thing called the overconfidence effect. And essentially what happens is the more people know about stuff, the more their confidence grows. Okay, right? The problem is their confidence grows vastly faster and at a greater rate than their actual empirical competence about a subject does. And I want to pull these out because, when I report these kinds of studies, I'm telling you about all those poor, benighted people out there in the world who are subject to these things and they do all these things. But guess what? We are those poor, benighted people. I'm one of those people. You're those people too. We're subject to the overconfidence effect. We're subject to motivated reasoning. We're not talking just about the people outside this room. And that's important in terms of informing our own practices with respect to activism and to how to try to change the world. Okay, now this also plays a role with respect to meat demand. So if you take people with a high school education, their likelihood of preferring meat is about the same, whether they're liberal Democrats or Republicans. But you educate the Republicans and they actually want to eat a little more meat, and you educate the Democrats and they actually want to eat a lot less meat. So the political ideology effect even is there with respect to meat demand, and prediction will become much stronger in the future as polarization increases. And that's, I think, going to be, again, very important when you're talking about trying to change the world. And indeed, this is a slide that shows the change over time. So in about 2013, it looks like, according to this study, Democratic liberals actually had a greater preference for meat than Republicans, but then people finally got their politics sorted out and realized that it actually applied to meat consumption, and are now on the righteous course of Democrats reducing and Republicans, staying the course, right? Okay, so then there's something called the rebound effect, which is sometimes called the Jevons paradox. And so Jevons writes in his treatise on coal that it's wholly a confusion of ideas to suppose that the economical use of fuel is equivalent to a diminished consumption. The very contrary is the truth. Now, the basic concept is that that efficiency with respect to something, whatever it is, some X, whether it's coal or whether it's meat, whatever, is equivalent to increasing the productivity of the thing in question, which reduces the implicit price of the thing, which then increases the demand, or it creates a consumer surplus that then can be allocated in different ways. So that's theoretically what drives the rebound effect. Now, again, I want to put a caveat in here on the rebound effect, because this stuff here that I'm going to be talking about is mostly explained in economic terms, but it's important to remember that law, norms, values, and other cultural constructs can also play a role in, quote, price, if you will, because they're affecting the incentives to consume or not to consume. So here's an example of the rebound effect. So what we want here is the straight line, basically. We want to build these fuel-efficient cars so that we're going to use less energy. But there is a risk of rebounding in two different ways. One is, well, guess what? Gasoline is now cheap, so I drive more, right? Because I sort of have a budget for gasoline, and I can save 10% off the budget and still drive 10% more. So that's kind of a direct rebounding here. But there's also an indirect dimension of the rebound effect, which is that I've saved so much money driving my car that I'm going to go on a vacation to Spain now, right? Which, of course, radically increases my carbon footprint. So the rebound effect has been very well studied with respect to energy. And there is an academic consensus, which is that the rebound effect with respect to energy is very low to moderate, but it can actually be very high depending on circumstances. And so what people say is that's why you need more than efficiency. You also have to create other kinds of disincentives for using the thing whose consumption you want to reduce. That efficiency is not going to be enough. You'll lose something to the rebound effect, and you could lose a lot depending on particularities of the context. Now, another area where we see this is with ride-hailing. And this is one of my favorite things, since I hate Uber, motivated reasoning in action. But Travis Kalanick said in 2015, we envision a world where there's no more traffic in Boston in 5 years. Now, I think there are some people here who live in Boston, and I haven't been there lately, but there's no more traffic, is that right? Yeah. Right. Well, so just for example, there's been a lot of work in this area. There's a 2017 paper which looked at the impact of ride-hailing platforms in a number of urban areas, and basically concluded that 49 to 61% of these ride-hailing trips would either not have been taken at all, or they would have been done by walking, biking, or public transport. So they're essentially adding. So the academic consensus then is essentially ride-hailing is actually adding to congestion rather than reducing congestion, right? So kind of a classic case of the rebound effect. And again, one that actually could have been anticipated if people, weren't so much in thrall of this thing, that sort of greater efficiency will mean less of the thing in question rather than more of the thing in question. Yet another 19th century lesson which we've forgotten. Okay, well, so what about meat consumption? So there isn't, unsurprisingly, a lot of work that's been done in this area. I'll just very quickly point to two studies. So one is a Swedish study, and the idea is that if people switch to a vegetarian diet and they then allocate the savings according to their pre-existing preference structure, how much rebounding is there? And it turns out that the rebound effect is very high that way if people's preferences remain stable after becoming vegetarian, right? There's another study, again, a very small study, which sort of the focus of the study is on what happens if you add vegan and vegetarian options to a cafeteria menu. What effect does that have on the choice of the meat option? And it turns out that if you just add more plant-based options, you get a very strong effect in terms of plant-based purchases, and that team found no rebound effect. So it meant that if you went plant-based for lunch, you didn't go home and go, oh, now I'm going to have a burger because I had those vegetables at lunch, right? So that didn't happen. But again, a very, very, very limited study. Okay, so closely related to the rebound effect is something called the substitution effect. And the substitution effect refers to the change in demand for a good as a result of a change in the relative price of the good compared to that of other substitute goods, okay? So let me just give you an example. So suppose that I'm a guy who likes to drink hot caffeinated drinks, right? And the price of coffee goes up. To what degree do I substitute tea for coffee then, right? And so the substitution effect, so the perfect substitution effect would basically say that there would be a one-to-one substitution. So if the price of coffee goes up, I substitute with tea, I maintain my consumption of caffeinated hot drinks with the switch to tea, right? Okay, that's the substitution effect. Now, if you look at meat consumption, and I think in our community people talk a lot about this, and I think we actually sort of think we know more about this than we actually do. But if you just look at the American meat consumption data, well, there you see the substitution effect, right? So you do get this decline in beef consumption, and you get this spike up in chicken consumption. What's happening? Well, people are going off beef and they're going on to chicken. There's a substitution that's occurring here. But actually, if you look at this globally, yeah, there's some substitution going on probably, but substitution ain't the big thing. The big thing is the steep increase in the curve, right? There's just more of everything sort of being consumed all the time. And what's happening with respect to substitution looks, kind of washes out at the macro level. And here's something that I think is interesting, and I haven't had time to do the statistics on this. So I don't want you to sort of kind of overgeneralize from the way these slides look, because they're not statistically normalized in the same way. But the basic message here is that with meat consumption, essentially what you see is greater meat consumption per capita that's correlated with higher income per capita. And you have an upward slope. And you have these outliers like India, for example, where you have these strong religious and cultural taboos that suppress meat production. And you have other outliers like Argentina, which for whatever reason, right, has very high meat consumption. But basically, you get this correlation. The more money you make per capita, the more meat you consume per capita. And here's what I think is interesting, is, again, don't overreact to the thickness of the line. But what's interesting is, of course, this is exactly the same with CO2 emissions, right? That essentially CO2 emissions per capita increase in a way that's correlated with GDP per capita. And I think there is an enormous amount to learn, actually, from looking at these two graphs, both with respect to how these issues are structurally the same, and with respect to how these issues might actually look different once you get in the data and understand the outliers. Because on the CO2 emissions case, there's also outliers, right? So some countries, for example, who have the same level of GDP per capita, I mean, you know, will sometimes have lower emissions than other countries. So I think in some way we're dealing with two issues here that are structurally very similar, but understanding the nuances of the ways they're the same and different, I think could actually be quite revealing. And then there's also some interesting natural experiments. So one had to do with the UK mad cow outbreak, and there's a few papers on this topic. In the UK, so in the United States, it looks like you get more rebounding. In the UK, you get a little less rebounding. And in Switzerland, you get very little rebounding from women and lots of rebounding from men. That's roughly the story of these three papers. But again, these are small samples. They're very regional studies, and it would be too much to make too much out of this. But yet, the mad cow epidemic would have been a wonderful thing to have studied, and I wish we had much more research actually looking at substitution effects when people stopped eating beef. Now, I think we might see a natural experiment, regretfully in many ways, in India, as the Hindu nationalist government increasingly suppresses and perhaps outlaws the slaughter of cattle. It's going to be interesting to see whether there is a substitution to other animal protein in the wake of that. So I think that is something people should be looking at and should be wanting to study. And also, interestingly enough, I mean, especially when you're talking about legislation, prohibition turns out to be really interesting. And by that I mean the American experiment in prohibiting alcohol, which has been incredibly well studied. And there's a lot of nuance in what people have come to understand about the respect in which it suppressed alcohol consumption and the respect in which it didn't. You know, the kind of standard view, oh, prohibition was a big failure, we got rid of it, happy days, we're here again, way too simple. That is just simply not true at all. And if you're interested in eliminating or reducing alcohol consumption, prohibition in many ways worked for various periods of time. Okay, so here's, I think at this point, what we know about substitution effects. So substitution does occur, but it's radically understudied both temporally, in terms of temporal substitution, spatially, where it occurs, and the scale at which it occurs. There's very little understanding of what really drives substitution and to what extent it's malleable. Can you take a situation where you might see a high level of substitution and actually turn that downward? And what appears to be the case from what we know at this point is there's a great deal of heterogeneity with respect to substitution, which is to say that when people sort of simply say, oh, well, if you suppress, you know, beef consumption or whatever, it's all going to go to chicken, no matter where you are in whatever part of the world at any moment. I mean, the right attitude to have towards that is maybe. It's possible, but we really don't actually know. There's not much by way of generalization that one can make with respect to substitution effects. Now, risk compensation is another one that is interesting that I think affects health arguments with respect to reducing or eliminating meat consumption. And this literature started to evolve with the beginning of seatbelt laws because actually what happened, and there's pretty good data to show this, is that when mandatory seatbelt laws came into effect, the world became more dangerous for pedestrians because people started driving in a riskier way. And so then it became this interesting policy question as to how many dead pedestrians you were going to trade off against how many dead drivers, when in particular the deaths were being caused by the drivers driving more recklessly because they personally were safe. There's something a little bit like this now with the turn to large vehicles, right, as well. So again, this is an area in which some things are known, some things are not known. There's, again, a great deal of difference in heterogeneity with respect to how much risk compensating that actually goes on in different contexts. But again, it's another thing to think about. If you're making a health argument for a vegan diet, and the effect of that means that people just go out and start injecting drugs or something, right? You kind of have lost the health argument in that regard. So it's actually kind of good, at least, good to know to what extent people risk compensate and when and in what contexts. Now, here's another one, right? I mean, especially for Americans, we somehow can't get over our technophilia, that new technologies are going to usher us into the promised land and save the world, sort of no matter what the issue is. And I think the person who's done the most to disabuse us of this is a sociologist at the University of Oregon named Richard York. And I'll just refer quickly to sort of 3 of his papers. So in one, he's shown that over the last 50 years, 3/4 of the alternative energy that has been produced has actually added to rather than replaced fossil fuels, right? Now, that's not the way environmentalists talk about this, right? We talk about alternative energy, right? It's going to just drive those suckers out, right? Well, that hasn't been what's happened over the last 50 years, or at least it only has at a very, very low rate. And then he has a recent paper which shows, again, this won't come as a surprise to most people in this room, but essentially aquaculture has almost entirely supplemented rather than replacing capture fisheries, right? And again, you hear these environmental arguments for aquaculture, right? Oh, we can protect the seas and have marine protected areas because we're just going to all do this with aquaculture. Sorry, dude, that's just not what's happening, right? Underneath the rhetoric. And then there's also, I think, a wonderfully detailed paper about petroleum not saving the whales, because again, it's sort of textbook story, as we used to use whale oil for all this stuff. Then we got petroleum, so the whales were now safe, because we could use petroleum instead of whale oil. But actually what happened is that the real period when the whales were driven almost to extinction was after petroleum became widely available, because you could use it to power your boats, basically, and your harpoons and so on. So it actually accentuated initially the pressure on whales rather than actually saving them. So again, there's a lot of technological optimism that's just sort of baked in that we need to be very careful about. And you could talk about a whole bunch of other cases. The Green Revolution was supposed to eliminate global hunger, but actually a huge amount of the additional productivity went to feed animals so that rich people could eat more meat. More or less the same thing has been true of GMO foods. Does anyone remember when the paperless office was supposed to exist because of the digital revolution? That's kind of like no traffic in Boston, right? No congestion in Boston. And of course, here we're squarely now in the area of political economy, which people tend to avoid, which is that new technologies are created in and absorbed by and interact in complex ways with existing structures of power. That's how it works. I mean, these technologies could be used in other ways, but how they're actually going to be used depends on who controls them. And in an existing power structure, they're going to simply be expressions of the existing power structure, not liberations from the existing power structure. So I'm sorry to break the hearts of all you people who are so disappointed with the behavior of Facebook. So we've got some interesting emerging technologies here. And so I want to mention e-cigarettes, because the current policy debate about e-cigarettes really brings out some of the complexities here, is because it looks like what's happening, and again, all this is pretty tentative at the moment, is it looks like e-cigarettes for non-smokers is additional in the sense that people who aren't smoking start smoking e-cigarettes and then go on to combustible cigarettes, so bad. But it looks like for existing smokers, there is actually a high substitution effect. So you're taking existing smokers of combustible cigarettes and you're getting them onto e-cigarettes, which is good. So what do you say about e-cigarettes, right? Because you essentially have trade-offs between different cohorts, different groups of societies. In one case, they're beneficial, one case, they're not, and yet you have to make a policy decision that sort of threads that needle. And again, this is an emerging issue that we'll see more about. But again, it shows you the heterogeneity in terms of how these new technologies actually interact with consumption. And I think, I'm hugely optimistic about plant-based meat, for example. So don't in any way misunderstand me. But I think we're going to be in for a whole lot of big surprises as plant-based meat gets scaled up as a new technology that starts playing as a junior adult in this whole world of big technologies. And I think we need to be really aware of that the story isn't just that the world gets saved by the new technology. That's where the game starts, right? And where the game really gets played is in the way that it interacts with power. Okay, so now then to kind of go from the paradoxes to back to sort of the main thread, insofar as there is a main thread, which is how to change the world, I think there's 4 fundamental questions here that really need to be answered. And so rather than answering them, I give them names. That's an old academic trick that some of you know. And so the first thing I call the composition question. And basically what we know is that when you get those big changes, the collapse of communism, the abolition of slavery, it involves some interaction between governments, institutions, civil society, and individuals. These big changes are composed out of those elements. So the first thing, we got to get off this whole, individuals matter, governments matter. I mean, no, sorry. We're talking about some relations between all of those things. But what the relationships are is going to vary greatly from case to case, right? And in some cases, they may be causal. Individual action, does change civil society, or vice versa. In other cases, they're not going to be causal. They're going to be correlational, right? I mean, there's going to be all kinds of different relationships that exist between these elements, depending on particular cases. But when you're thinking about any particular social change, whatever that is, you need to think of it compositionally. What are the elements of that social change, and how do those elements interact? Secondly, there's an object question here. What is it that we want to change? And I think often there isn't a great deal of clarity about that. So again, to move to the climate change context, people say we have to do something about climate change, act on climate change, blah, blah, blah. But sometimes people act like we all should be good Protestants and accept the scientific consensus, and that's all that needs to happen. If you could just eliminate all the climate deniers from the world, and so we had one true church of climate change believers, that would count as success. Another measure of success is to get people to vote for candidates who support putting a price on carbon, focus on individuals reducing carbon footprints. I mean, all kinds of different things. So what is it that we're trying to do when we want climate action? There are literally dozens, maybe hundreds of things that could be indicated by that. And of course, I think the same thing is true with respect to animal protection, right? We could mean many, many different things. There could be many different objects of concern of the things that we think fundamentally we have to change. And by the way, I want to, just give a big shout out, because whatever else you think about his tactics and his goals, the great old activist Henry Spira was like a laser when it came to the objects of change. Once he decided this is what it's about, he didn't want to hear about anything else. This is what counted as success. And I'm not saying it was always right or it's the same issues today, but it's that clarity of focus that I think is hugely important. So sometimes it's specific behaviors we want to change, like smoking. We don't care whether people love the Marlboro Man or what they believe about cancer and smoking. We want them to stop. In other cases, it's norms. We recognize recycling. We all screw up and put plastic number 2 in when only plastic number 3 should be in, but we want people to inculcate the norms. In other cases, it's deeper values. I mean, I want to say at the outset, this may be photoshopped. I don't know, but I love it anyway, because it indicates that often what we're really concerned with is the way a whole cluster or network of mutually reinforcing values, actually, can fit together, and that the only way to really make significant progress is somehow to dismantle this whole network of values. It's not just a matter of changing individual behaviors. Okay, and then there is what I call the agent question. So who are the agents of change? What makes a good agent of change? Now, one thing that's interesting is there's actually much more evidence, weirdly, that consistency matters more for experts than advocates, but in a field. But there is some evidence that it matters for advocates. So it's important, if you're going to go out and sort of tell people they all ought to be vegan, it's probably a good thing not to be caught at McDonald's, having a Big Mac. But there is also something else called do-gooder derogation, right? Which is if you're seen as too otherworldly or self-righteous or remote from the experiences of your audience, that falls into off the cliff into, oh, Dale, he's just this crazy do-gooder, you really can't take anything he does or says seriously, even if he's living the perfect Jane life, sweeping the ants, out of the way and has perfect consistency and no hypocrisy in his actions. In fact, some ways that just makes things even worse. So there's kind of a very kind of small window here which requires consistency without this falling into the edge of being simply seen as a do-gooder whose views are not worth taking seriously. Now, there's an interesting issue about, and most of these things are sort of two-sided. There's a good side and a bad side. And so identity terms are interesting. And I've been particularly interested over my lifetime seeing sort of vegan lifestyle and sort of the concept of being a vegan sort of increasingly hardening into a kind of identity term. And so, there's research that shows that essentially only drug addicts are evaluated more negatively than vegetarians and vegans. So there's a real danger in this identity term, being this person, this kind of person. We don't want that kind of person, right? And I'm also, sort of interested in this because in the HIV/AIDS epidemic, there was a huge, important, successful, great campaign to get rid of homosexuals as a risk category in favor of focusing on high-risk behaviors, right? This was really important to changing behaviors because lots of people were engaging in high-risk behaviors who didn't identify with the identity term, right? And people who identify with the identity term were not necessarily always engaging in high-risk behaviors. Now, of course, the power of identity terms is it creates intra-group solidarity. Vegans united will never be defeated, right? We can sort of march off into battle together, having cemented our identities. But when it actually comes to changing the world, it really is a double-edged sword. And then the last two things about this I want to mention is that redemption stories are very powerful. They're very important, and I think there's a lot of work to be done on what kinds of redemption stories are powerful and which kinds aren't, because there are different kinds of stories. And then there is the subject of viral agents, which we're learning a lot about in the presidential campaigns, but we've known this for a long time. Again, going back to the 80s and recycling campaigns, that if an expert tells you about recycling, you yawn and watch TV. But if your ignorant brother-in-law tells you about recycling, you go, yeah, buddy, what should I do, right? And so part of all of the fake news, the bots and all of that, kind of rests on this insight that, that sourcing is hugely important for messaging. And you can actually create fictional and non-existent sources for your messages. And often they're I'm not recommending this, but they're often, they're often much more powerful than you are, okay? All right. Okay, then there's an audience question. I'm gonna skip some stuff because I'm trying your patience. Now, I just want to give you an example to just really bring out how difficult it is to make the kinds of changes we're talking about. So here's two guys who got elected president. Ex ante. Come on, he won the popular vote, you know. Ex ante, completely unpredictable, you know. Barack Hussein Obama being elected president, yeah, sure, right. So ex ante, completely unpredictable. You would think a presidential election is not so complicated, what you're trying to predict, right? I mean, it's a binary by the time we get to the election. It's one person or the other person. Now, it's true that since we're not a democracy in America, we make it more difficult because there's really only 538 people who get to vote, really, the Electoral College, right? So you have to break this apart, so it gets more complicated, but it's still a pretty simple thing, right? In a way, it's just this one or that one, right? In a kind of broadly, publicly responsive thing that has been studied by vast numbers of people and hundreds of millions of dollars. So everybody's into this, right? And guess what? We've got a lot of theories about how this works, right? You got to have a compelling, positive vision. No, negative campaigning, that's what's effective. You know, appeals to fear and insecurity, scare them, that's what, you know. Oh, it's the swing voters. No, it's the base enthusiasm. Oh, the state of the economy, when you got a 3% growth rate, you know, a camel could get elected president, right? You know, so you got all these theories out there in political science world and in talking head world. Now, I love this story because the hottest person in political forecasting now is a woman named Rachel Cofer. And, you know, and tomorrow she may be nothing, because that's how it is in Andy Warhol America. But she predicted correctly, her model correctly predicted the outcome of every House race except one, right? So she just aced everyone in the last electoral cycle. And she's also got this incredible personal narrative. She was a single mom who didn't go to college, and she went to junior college, and then she ended up showing up all these guys, you know, as being the phonies and frauds and overpaid CNN contributors that they are. But anyway, and the other thing that's cool is her model is incredibly simple. So it just takes into account in each district or state what you're trying to measure, the intensity of partisan support, the diversity of the population, and the fraction with a college education. That's all you need to know, and that's what the model runs on for predictions. And so a consequence of her view is that the candidates are irrelevant, essentially. You could nominate the camel, and as long as those three variables are engaged, that's going to determine the election. Okay, now my point here is, you know, you would think we would have this down, right? You know, that there wouldn't be possible for some young radical to come along and overturn, you know, this mega industry that's all devoted to solving what shouldn't be that complicated a question. So if it's, you know, it's not easy even to predict relatively small macro changes. So now I'm going to end by giving you Dale's rules for radicals, with apologies to Saul Alinsky. Now, so the whole thing about this is I'm not saying science tells you this, right? I'm saying these are my impressions, you know, based on having been involved with a lot of losing causes for a long time in my life, about some things that might work. So, you know, consider the source. So first of all, respect the facts. And there's a lot of reasons for respecting the facts. But one reason for respecting the facts is because they can come back and bite you. And I'm just going to mention one little thing here, but it's a really big topic, which is animal protection movement being way involved, getting really into climate change, really good thing, but all it's going to take for climate change is to, you know, invent a non-farting cow, or for everyone to get really interested in geoengineering, and diet is going to drop out. And it's, you know, and there's a lot of reason to be concerned about climate change because it's climate change and not just because of its connection to animals. And it's very important, I think, to be very clear-minded and straight ahead about that and not just sort of try to spin this up so that it seems to provide the most support, you know, for the particular thing that I want to do on a particular occasion. Secondly, I say keep value change at the center. By that, I don't mean that the appeals should always be about value change. But fundamentally, the kind of world I think we're talking about with animal protection does involve massive changes of values. We're not just interested in behavior change, except as a vehicle to some much more profound value change. And so there's a sense in which particular actions and campaigns, I think, sort of have to be assessed relative to the possibility of making these fundamental changes. Own the language. It's hugely important that plant-based meat be meat. This is a huge fight. We don't say that electricity that comes from solar energy isn't electricity, because it's essential to electricity that it be generated by coal, right? It is really important to own these terms and to own this language. Milk, meat, they're really worth fighting for. Symbolic behavior matters. In energy consumption world, it's still the case. If you go and survey a bunch of people about the most effective thing they can do, to reduce energy and attack global warming, they'll say turn off the lights. Not so, sorry, But you don't get anywhere by telling people, no, forget the lights, that doesn't matter. What you really need to be doing is that you need to respect symbolic behavior, because symbolic behavior is part of joining a tribe, it's part of embracing a norm, it's part of entering a new community, but don't fetishize the symbolic behavior, right? Because it is a vehicle on the way to something, it's not an end in itself. So walk the walk, but don't strut your stuff, right? Because we're back to do-gooder derogation when you strut your stuff. The most difficult challenge, I think, is to make the unthinkable thinkable. So once something like a plant-based diet becomes something people can contemplate, you're most of the way there. The hardest thing is to get something that's seen as inconceivable, unthinkable, not on the agenda, actually on the agenda. And in that respect, I think we should feel very heartened. Choose your object carefully. Nothing ever happens for one reason. Focus on the negative. It's a lot easier to mobilize people to stop something than to actually do something. And it's very hard to do something good until you've stopped something bad. So don't be apologetic about focusing on the negative. The environmental movement in particular has had almost all of its successes are negative, almost zero positive successes. Now, I've got my own, people have different versions of this rule, but my version is the 10-70-20 rule. Is that to get social change, you need about 10% activists, and you need to beat down the militant opposition to less than 30%, in the 20 to 30% range. The big audience is the 70% in the middle, who you're just asking for permission. You're just saying, will you go along with this ride? Will you not be part of the 30%? And I think so much activity and messaging and so on and so forth is all about trying to make the 10% 12%, right? Or 13%, and not just about asking permission from the overwhelming majority of people. Communism didn't collapse because so many people fell in love with liberal democracy. Communism collapsed because people lost confidence in the system under which they were living and said, okay, well, we're along for change. We're open to change. We're along for the ride. That's what we need, and that is where the real center where change happens, and I think that's not always what we target. Pay attention to backsliding. More people are ex-vegans and vegetarians than are vegans and vegetarians. Know when to hold them and know when to fold them. Things we do don't always work out. This whole business of campaigning is all adaptive learning. You try things, they fail, and we need to study these things, so it's not just anecdotal, but we actually need to take even failed campaigns and turn this into real shareable data. And then finally, be opportunistic. And I just want to very quickly, in my remaining minute, just mention a very opportunistic project that I'm engaged in now in China with my colleague Yifei Li. We're hiring a postdoc now, if anyone knows a great bilingual Chinese-English postdoc. But again, it's a 3-year project that is devoted to doing what we can do to sort of bend that terrible upward slope on meat consumption in China and to bend it down a little bit. And it sort of aligns with my rules for radicals, because at this point, to some extent, the project is aligned with the PRC government, which actually wants to reduce beef consumption. NYU Shanghai, for various reasons, is a good place to do it. And the third thing, which I think is hugely important, is that China is in the middle of global meat consumption per capita, but at the moment it's still low in beef by global standards. And although the government would like to increase dairy consumption, dairy is still largely culturally inappropriate in China. So this is a case where we can focus on the negative and try to prevent some things from getting worse, even if we can't produce the best. Okay, so in conclusion, history does not have a direction. One of my favorite movies, Bob Roberts was a right-wing, Tim Robbins was a right-wing folk singer whose theme song was sort of a parody of Bob Dylan's, "The times they are a-changin' back," right? And they do. There's no, we're not on the side of history, history isn't gonna, there's no arc of history. Progress is sawtooth, the worst often happens right before the best. Change is multidimensional. We've outlawed slavery, but guess what? We still have slavery in the oceans and all sorts of other places. That beautiful story of how we've entered this new, lovely, progressive era in which all the sins of the past are gone is always a myth. It's always a story. It's never true. We can make things better. Things can become worse, but there isn't going to be complete victory with any of this. And, progress is ugly and uncertain and contested. So John Brown's Harper's Ferry Raid in 1859, historians are still fighting about whether this was on the side of progress towards emancipation or whether, in fact, this set back the cause. More than 100 years later, we still don't understand that. How much confidence can we have going forward in ex ante? So honestly, the happy message is you may never know whether you've succeeded in what you do. I mean, this cause we're all embarked on is larger than a single lifetime, but that's not a reason not to try with modesty and humility to try to make these changes. And in some ways, the most important part of the reason for doing this is because it aligns your life with your values. I mean, however this story turns out, you will have lived a life that's meaningful to you. This is a photograph that I actually took of Nelson Mandela's cell on Robben Island, and if Mandela would have died in that cell, he would have lived a profoundly important life. Thank you.